Kestrel feeds on things like field voles, mice, rats, but also lizards, frogs, and even small birds. But their favourite food of all are field voles, and of course the Kestrel also has, as well as its hovering ability, it also has those special senses that give it some sort of UV vision, which allows it to not only see voles but also their urine, because it can follow the trail of a field vole, usually made by its urine, to the field vole itself, and then it will dive down, swing its talons forward, and grab a hold of its prey. And of course, while they're no danger to us as humans, if you were a rodent, then this would be your living nightmare. And another thing about the Kestrel is that they were actually flown by, of course, they were the only bird in medieval falconry that the knave, or the peasant, was allowed to fly. And of course, they're not a falconer's bird because they mostly feed on voles, rats and mice, and if you go and skin a rat, there wouldn't really be a lot left to eat. And of course, unfortunately, it seems that a lot of Kestrel chicks were taken from the wild in the 1960s because of the movie Kess, about a young boy who befriends an orphaned, I think it was an orphaned Kestrel that he learns to fly. But, I mean, I'm not entirely sure. I've never seen that movie before. Even so, this is one of our most beautiful birds of prey, and one that I've seen many, many times. And here is their range. Now, the next animal I'm going to show you is probably our most common animal. It is the rabbit. Now, rabbits weren't originally native to Britain. In fact, I think they were brought over by either the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, or the Normans. Same with the brown hare, because if you look at a brown hare and a rabbit side by side, you'll see the difference. Hares are a lot bigger, and they're more built for speed, whereas rabbits are a little bit smaller, and of course they're most famous for digging holes called burrows. But of course, a big colony of rabbits can make a large system of burrows that's called a warren. And of course, rabbits are herbivores, so they feed on grass and flowers and pretty much all kinds of plants, but quite occasionally, like in Beatrix Potter's Peter Rabbit, they will occasionally raid vegetable gardens. But, so as I meant, of course, rabbits are preyed on by many animals. Like in Britain, they're preyed on by stoats, weasels, badgers, as well as foxes, and of course birds of prey like buzzards, hawks and eagles. Of course that has no impact on the species, because rabbits are well known for one thing: breeding. And of course rabbits breed like rabbits. Of course usually a male, known as a buck, will usually get at least a harem, which is a group of females called does. And of course he'll mate with all of them, and they will each give birth to a litter of kittens. And of course rabbits are numerous throughout Britain. Of course, one of the main reasons why they're preyed on by so many animals is because, I mean, if rabbits weren't preyed on by so many predators, then they basically just eat themselves into oblivion because they eat so much food. And if they weren't prey animals for anything, they basically just eat themselves into hunger. In fact, that's probably most well explained in Watership Down, the book by Richard Adams, when we learn about the story of Alacharal, who was the Prince of Rabbits. And of course, he refused Lord Frith, the creator, to basically he refused to control his people, and so Thrift found ways to control them, where he created the dog, the cat, the fox, the weasel, the hawk, the badger, the wolf, and basically every predator of rabbits. But he did give Alacharal the ability to be able to outwit some predators, and of course he told him to be cunning, full of tricks, and your people shall never be destroyed. Of course, I've seen rabbits multiple times, and of course after the decline in rabbit gamekeeping after the First World War, their numbers have basically spread across much of Britain, and that means that there's more of them, but they're kept in check by predators like birds of prey and foxes. But even so, they are still some of the most numerous but also adorable creatures in all of Britain. As you can see, they're widespread across all of Britain. Now, the next animal I'm going to show you is one of our most elusive birds of prey, but of course another common bird of prey. It is the sparrowhawk. Now, sparrowhawks are one of the most common birds of prey in the British Isles. In fact, they're our third most common. And of course, this one here is a male. You can tell he's a male because his chest is like bright orange. And of course, this is the female, and she's always a lot bigger than the male. And the thing is, like sparrowhawks, because when it comes to what they feed on, only the male, because the male's a lot smaller than the female, because he's only able to catch small birds like finches, chiffchaffs, tits, wagtails, and wrens, and basically all the small songbirds. And of course the female, because she's a lot bigger than the male, she could quite easily catch something like pigeons, crows, jays, and maybe even small mammals like young rabbits. And of course, they do mate for life, like all birds of prey, and usually the female will spend 30 to 88 days on her nest, just incubating the eggs. And of course, it's the male's task to provide her with food during that time, because she can't go out and feed herself. And of course, when the eggs hatch, they both take it in turns to look after the eggs, look after the chicks, while the other goes to hunt for food. And of course, how they hunt is because sparrowhawks are ambush predators. They rely on the element of surprise to catch their prey. And of course, how they do it is first they start by flying low above the ground and using as much cover as they can, like trees and hedges. And quite often they will sneak up on prey in gardens, like garden bird feeders. They will use every bit of cover to get unbelievably close. But the last thing that a garden bird, like a blue tit, a wood pigeon, or a robin, will see in its life is a pair of talons coming at it, and then bang! It's all over within the blink of an eye, with just feathers and, of course, the alarm calls of other birds. And of course, when I said that sparrowhawks are common in Britain, they can also be quite elusive. And of course, I spent nearly 20 years waiting to see my first sparrowhawk. I mean, the first time I saw sparrowhawk was when I was living with my mum. I saw one, and I knew it was a female because she managed to kill a fully grown wood pigeon. She was in our garden plucking away at a pigeon, and it was actually the first time I'd ever seen a sparrowhawk properly, and that I'd actually seen one hunting. And I saw that same bird about 3 times afterwards, and I even got to see. In fact, I even once got to see a sparrowhawk catching and killing a starling in my mum's garden. And that was the first time I'd actually seen a proper bird of prey hunt, and it was the most mind-blowing morning of my life. Yeah, sparrowhawks are found across Britain, but they are still very, very hard to see for some people. Where is their range? Now, the next animal I'm going to show you all is one of our most common birds. It is the song thrush. Now, the song thrush can be heard living up to its name in spring when the male performs from the treetops to proclaim his breeding territory. And of course, the song of the thrush is very rich, vibrant, croaky and rasping, and of course it usually is done in different pitches. Like the male will sing one verse 2 or 3 times before moving on to the next. And of course, as you can see here, there's a song thrush, which is a lot smaller than a missel thrush. It's dark brown on top with white and reddish brown on its chest, but it's a bit smaller. And the missel thrush is pure white on the underside with black speckling and light brown back. And of course, the missel thrush is also larger than the song thrush. But a very good way to determine which thrush you're watching is to try and see how high up in the tree it's perched, because the missel thrush tends to favour the very top of the tallest tree, while the song thrush can be found slightly lower down. Of course, once he's established his territory, the male will then use his song to attract a female, and it's she that builds the nest, which is usually a cup of mud inside woven grasses and twigs that can take weeks to complete. The pair will usually raise 2 broods in a season, sometimes more, though since the 1970s the song thrush has been in decline, particularly in farmland areas, which has resulted in the destruction of hedgerows and woodlands that provide much of the thrush's food, as well as safe nest sites. But also the use of pesticides that are used by farmers and gardeners to kill slugs are also to blame, and they're also affecting its main food source, snails. Of course, some thrushes feed on mostly invertebrates like worms, beetles, lice, wood lice and stuff like that. But one of their favourite foods is snails. The song thrush and the missel thrush have both evolved a very unique talent for eating snails, which is done by no other bird. What they do is the thrush will pick up a snail shell that it knows has a snail in it. Then it will use a rock or a paving slab like an anvil and will smash the snail shell to pieces against it until it completely smashes the shell to bits and it can get to the snail inside. Although that's probably the most well-known of the song thrush's techniques, they get much of their food in other ways. One way is by, as you can see here, having a tug of war with a worm in the grass. And of course, song thrushes, unfortunately, have also struggle to survive in winter, but they do manage to get through with the help of people leaving food out for them on feeders or bird tables. And that's another way you can help these birds is by having a wild patch in your garden where the song thrush can nest, find food to raise its young, and of course perform its famous song. So There's its range.